Night seized the small town of Redemption, Montana, with cold, bony fingers. The rain, which had begun as a fine drizzle at sunset, had turned into a merciless downpour, drumming on the shingled roofs and turning the main street into a filthy, impassable mire. At this hour, when the pious townfolk were deep in their dreams and the sinners were just beginning their trade in the dimly lit Golden Horseshoe Saloon, a special, sacred silence reigned in a house at the very edge of town, where civilization gave way to the wild prairies. This was the funeral parlor of William Thatcher, and its silence was as thick as velvet and as heavy as a tombstone. William, a man whose face seemed carved from the same granite of sorrow as the monuments in the town cemetery, was just finishing polishing the lid of a small, child-sized coffin. The work was sorrowful, but necessary. Diphtheria had spared no one this autumn. A sudden, desperate knock on the massive oak door made him freeze. The sound was uneven, frantic, as if made not by a fist but by a crazed bird trying to fly through a window. Thatcher was not expecting visitors. No one ever came to him without cause. His threshold was crossed either by the grief-stricken or by those who brought grief to others. He slowly set down a rag soaked in wax and walked to the door, his heavy work boots making no sound on the sawdust-strewn floor. The smell of formaldehyde and pine shavings, the eternal companion of his trade, seemed to grow thicker. "Who's there?" His voice was low and steady, like the drone of a church organ at a funeral. In response came a choked sob and a new, even more furious volley of blows. "Help me! I beg you, help me!" It was a woman's voice, young, trembling with cold and terror. Something in that voice, a primal note of fear, made William cast all caution aside. He turned the heavy iron key and yanked the door open. On the threshold, a girl stood swaying. Soaked to the bone, her light-colored dress was a filthy rag clinging to her thin frame. Her bare feet were caked in blood and mud. But the most terrifying thing was her face, white as a sheet, with enormous eyes wide with horror. An ugly bruise was darkening on her cheekbone. It was Emma Granger, the adopted daughter of the Reverend Finch, the pastor of Redemption's only church. "Help me! He'll kill me!" she whispered, her gaze darting back into the roaring darkness of the street. Without a word, William pulled her inside and slammed the door, turning the key in the lock once more. The girl went limp, sliding down the wall to the floor, her body racked with violent shivers. "Who?" Thatcher asked curtly. Oh, he already suspected. In a town this small, everyone knew everyone's business, and everyone knew of Reverend Finch's fatherly discipline. "My stepfather, the Reverend—" she breathed, unable to speak his name. She had barely finished when a new sound came from the street. Heavy, confident footsteps slicing through the streams of water. They stopped directly in front of the door. And then came another knock, entirely different, not desperate, but imperious, demanding 3 measured, deafening blows that seemed to shake the very walls. William looked at Emma, huddled on the floor, then at the door. He knew that knock. Only one man in town knocked like that, a man who believed that any door should open for him at his first command. "William Thatcher," came the booming voice of Reverend Finch from the street, a voice trained for sermons. "In the name of the Lord, open up. A lost sheep from my flock has taken refuge in your house. My daughter, Emma. The devil has taken root in her, and I must cast him out." Emma cried out and pressed herself against the wall, covering her head with her hands. "Don't give me to him, please. He'll kill me." William silently walked to the door. His face expressed nothing but an infinite weariness. He was a man who had spent his entire life dealing with consequences. The consequences of disease, of accidents, violence. He saw the aftermath. And now, standing right outside his door, was the cause. "Reverend," William said calmly, his voice easily penetrating the thick oak, "it is the dead of night and a storm is raging. This is a house of sorrow, not a place to settle family disputes. Come in the morning." "Wicked man," Finch roared, "you harbor a sinner who has fled from her father's roof. She belongs to me. The law of God and man is on my side. Open this door or I will break it down." William Thatcher was not a tall man, but he was solidly built. Years spent as a field surgeon during the war between the states had taught him not only how to amputate limbs and stitch wounds, but also how to face death and the men who dealt it without a flicker of fear. He had seen generals and privates, heroes and butchers. Reverend Finch, with all his righteous fury, did not impress him in the slightest. Thatcher leaned his shoulder against the door as if he could hold it shut by the sheer force of his will. He looked at the trembling girl. In her eyes, he saw the same terror he had seen in the eyes of young soldiers in the field hospital at Gettysburg, the terror of inevitable brutal pain. And in that moment, something within him, long dormant and buried under layers of cynicism and fatigue, awoke. "This door will not open tonight, Reverend," he said, just as quietly, but now a note of steel had entered his voice. "This house is under my protection. Now leave before your anger brings true sin upon you." For a few moments, silence fell outside, broken only by the sound of the rain. Then came a scraping sound and heavy retreating footsteps. Emma timidly raised her head. "Is he gone?" "The question is, for how long?" William answered, not moving from his spot. He listened to the sounds outside for a few more minutes before stepping away from the door. He turned to Emma and truly looked at her for the first time. She couldn't have been more than 17. Slender, almost translucent, with a mass of tangled blonde hair now darkened by the rain. But deep in her frightened eyes, a spark of defiance still burned. A spark the Reverend had not yet managed to extinguish. William sighed. He wanted only one thing: peace, for the world to leave him alone with his dead, who, unlike the living, asked for nothing and created no problems. But the world, in the form of this drenched girl, had just burst into his orderly existence, and he knew he could no longer simply turn her out the door. This cat-and-mouse game was just beginning, and if you want to find out how William plans to protect her, don't forget to like this video. Your support helps us create stories like this. He led Emma deeper into the house, into his modest living quarters behind the workshop. He lit a kerosene lamp. The warm light pulled the room's humble furnishings from the gloom. It was an extension of its owner, austere, functional, devoid of all excess. An iron bed, neatly made with a gray soldier's blanket, a bookshelf, its shelves groaning under heavy volumes of anatomy, philosophy, and, oddly enough, poetry. A single table, upon which lay an open book and a cold cup of coffee. And an armchair by a small, meticulously cleaned fireplace. There was no hint here of the trade by which William earned his living, no smell of varnish, no ubiquitous wood shavings. This was his sanctuary, his fortress of silence. He motioned for Emma to take the armchair. "Sit, I'll get you something dry and warm." The girl, still shivering, sank into the chair, which seemed to swallow her fragile form. William disappeared behind a partition and returned a moment later with a coarse woolen blanket and his old campaign flask. He splashed some of its contents into a metal cup, added hot water from the kettle on the stove, and handed it to her. "Drink. It's brandy. It will warm you." Emma obediently took the cup with trembling hands. The first sip burned her throat, but a saving warmth immediately spread through her body. Meanwhile, William knelt before her, and without a word, gently took her wounded foot. His fingers, accustomed to the fine work of wood and flesh, were surprisingly gentle. "Glass," he stated, examining a deep gash on her sole. "The shards must be removed and the wound cleaned, or it will become infected." He looked up at her. His gaze was direct, calm, appraising, the gaze of a doctor, not an undertaker. For some reason, Emma felt neither fear nor embarrassment.
In this man surrounded by an aura of death, there was more life and safety than in all of her stepfather's sermons combined. She simply nodded in silence. William rose and fetched his old medical bag. He unrolled it on the floor, and the dim lamplight glinted off rows of shining steel instruments. Forceps, scalpels, needles. Emma flinched involuntarily. "Don't be afraid," he said, his voice even. "I've done this 1,000 times.
Trust me, bullet wounds are far worse." He placed her foot in a basin of warm water he'd brought from the stove and began to gently clean the cuts. "Tell me, what made you run barefoot into a night like this?" The hot water and brandy did their work. The shivering subsided, and the words, caught in her throat like a thorny knot, began to slowly emerge. She spoke haltingly, jumping from one thing to another, of the constant humiliation, of his heavy hand that found a reason for punishment in her every action, a floor not scrubbed clean enough, a soup not salted enough, a glance out the window that lasted, in his opinion, too long. He called it casting out pride, taming the flesh. He would quote Holy Scripture while striking her with a leather strap embossed with a line from the Psalms. Tonight he found my box," Emma whispered, while William, armed with forceps, concentrated on extracting the tiniest slivers of glass from her skin. "My mother's things were in it, a locket, a pair of ribbons, and a few dollars. I had been saving them. I wanted to leave this place, go to my aunt in St. Louis." William didn't look up, but his fingers froze for an instant. He pictured the scene. A large man, seething with rage, towering over a fragile girl, her pathetic treasures scattered across the floor. "He said that money is the root of all evil," Emma continued, her voice ringing with hatred. "That I had succumbed to the temptation of mammon. He threw the box into the fireplace, and when I tried to get it, he struck me. He said that tonight he would cast the devil out of me once and for all. He locked me in my room. I knew he would come back. I saw his eyes. They were inhuman. I climbed out the window, and I ran. I didn't know where. I just ran until I saw the light in your window." She fell silent, catching her breath. William finished with the last shard and began to treat the wounds with a pungent yellow salve. "Why come to me?" he asked quietly, without interrupting his work. "There's a sheriff in town. There are other people who could have helped." Emma gave a bitter laugh. "Sheriff Henderson? Every Sunday he sits in the front pew and listens reverently to my stepfather's sermons. Reverend Finch donated a great deal of money to build the new jail. The sheriff is in his pocket, and the others, they're afraid of him. He is a man of God. No one would believe me. They would decide I am a deceitful, ungrateful daughter being justly punished by a loving father." William applied a tight bandage. He stood, washed his hands in the instruments. The whole story was ugly, but unfortunately all too common. Hypocrisy and cruelty cloaked in a mask of piety. He had seen it dozens of times. But something in Emma's story troubled him. Something didn't fit the picture. "You said he donated a great deal of money," Thatcher said thoughtfully, pouring himself the rest of the coffee. "A preacher's salary in a town like this doesn't allow for large donations. As far as I know, he had no wealthy inheritance." Emma shrugged. "He often said that the Lord is generous to those who serve him zealously. He always had money. He often left at night. He'd say he was visiting the sick in remote settlements or spending time in solitary prayer. But he always returned strange, agitated. Sometimes there was mud on his clothes that didn't look like road dust. And one time," she hesitated, as if doubting whether she should continue. "One time what?" William prompted gently. "One time, cleaning his study, I found a bundle under a floorboard. I shouldn't have, but I was curious. It wasn't Bibles. It was maps of the area, the Rattlesnake Canyon region. Places were marked on the maps with crosses, and also strange calculations, arrival times,
Number of guards? I didn't understand any of it, but when I heard his footsteps, I got scared and put it all back. The next day, the sheriff announced that the Wells Fargo stagecoach coming from Helena was robbed in that very area. They never found the bandits. The room fell silent. Only the crackling of the logs in the fireplace and the subsiding of the rain outside could be heard. William Thatcher stood with his back to Emma, staring into the dark window where his own stern face was reflected. The picture was beginning to form. Reverend Finch was not just a domestic tyrant, he was something far worse.
The leader of a gang that robbed stagecoaches. It explained everything. The money, the nightly absences, and his limitless power in the town, backed not only by the word of God but by fear and money. And Emma, without knowing it, had become a dangerous witness. And now her escape attempt was not just a family problem for Finch. It was a threat to his entire enterprise. That was why he had been so furious. That was why he so desperately wanted her back. It wasn't about casting out a devil. It was about silencing her permanently. William turned slowly. He looked at the girl huddled in the chair, at her pale face and her huge eyes, full of fear and hope. He had come to this town seeking peace and oblivion. He wanted to simply do his work, to measure, to build, to bury, to draw a line under the stories of others. But someone else's story had come to him, and now he had to decide whether he would be its final chapter or help write a new one. "You need to rest," he said, his voice calmer than ever. He gestured to his bed. "Lie down here. I'll sit in the chair. You're safe for tonight. We'll talk about everything in the morning." "And him?" Emma whispered. "Will he come back?" William walked to the window and peered out at the street. The first light of dawn was painting the sky a leaden gray. The town was asleep, unaware of the serpent coiled in its bosom. "Oh yes," Thatcher answered quietly, as if speaking to himself. "He'll be back. But he won't come alone, and he won't be coming for a lost sheep. He'll be coming to eliminate a witness." And in that moment, William knew his quiet life was over. He had been drawn into a war against a man everyone considered a saint. And in this war, he had only one ally, a terrified girl with wounded feet. What do you think their plan is? Write your guesses in the comments. I'd be very interested to read them. In the meantime, we move on to the next part of this incredible story. William drew the curtain. He pulled a long wooden box from under his bed, one that no one had ever seen opened. He blew the dust from its lid and slowly raised it. Inside, nestled on worn velvet, lay a disassembled Army-issue Sharps rifle and a heavy Colt revolver. The weapons were in perfect condition, oiled and ready for a fight. He hadn't touched them since he'd taken off the blue uniform of the Union Army. He hated guns because he knew all too well what they did to human flesh. But he also knew there were times when the word of God fell silent and lead began to speak. And that time had come. The dawn over redemption was deceptively calm. The rain had stopped, leaving behind a world washed clean and fresh. The air smelled of wet earth and ozone. The first wisps of smoke began to rise from the chimneys as the small town slowly stirred to life. But for William Thatcher and Emma Granger, the night was not over. It had merely changed its color from black to gray. William had not slept. He sat in his armchair, methodically disassembling, cleaning, and oiling the rifle and the revolver. Every movement of his hands was precise, economical, honed by years of a practice he desperately wanted to forget. The clang of metal on metal, the smell of gun oil mixed with the aroma of brewing coffee, these were all ghosts from another life, a life where death was not a quiet conclusion, but a loud, bloody process. Emma, wrapped in his blanket, lay on the bed, but she wasn't sleeping either. She lay motionless, her eyes wide open, listening to every sound, both inside the house and out. She watched as the undertaker's hands, the same hands that had so gently tended her wounds, now handled the deadly iron with frightening dexterity. When the rifle was reassembled, William propped it against the fireplace. He poured 2 mugs of coffee,
black as tar, and handed one to Emma. "Drink. It's going to be a long day." She sat up in bed, taking the mug. Her hands were still trembling slightly. "What are you going to do?" "First," he said, sipping his coffee, "we'll have breakfast. An army marches on its stomach. And then we wait." "For what?" "For our dear Reverend to make his next move. He won't come back to break down the door. That would be too simple, too crude for a man of his standing. He's smarter than that. He will use what he considers his greatest weapon, his power over the minds of these people." William was right. Less than an hour had passed when footsteps were heard on the street.
But this time they were not solitary and furious, but measured, accompanied by the lazy creak of a leather gun belt. William gestured for Emma to stay in the room and make no sound, while he went to the workshop door. He did not open it. "Thatcher, this is Sheriff Henderson. Open up!" The sheriff's voice was deliberately loud so that any curious neighbors might hear. William opened a small window next to the door, designed for taking orders at night. "Good morning, Sheriff. To what do I owe this early visit?" Sheriff Henderson was a portly man, short of breath, with a face that always seemed slightly aggrieved. He was clearly uncomfortable standing on the threshold of a funeral parlor. "Let's not play games, Thatcher. The whole town's already buzzing. Reverend Finch says you're holding his daughter, Emma, against her will. Says the girl's not in her right mind, been reading too many cheap novels and ran off. He's worried for her soul and her safety." "The girl came to me of her own free will, Sheriff, seeking protection," William answered calmly, "and I have provided that protection. She is free to leave whenever she wishes, but as far as I can tell, she does not wish." "Listen, Thatcher." The sheriff lowered his voice and moved closer to the window. His eyes darted about. "I don't know you well, but you seem a reasonable man. Stay out of this, Thatcher. Reverend Finch is a respected man, a pillar of our community. You're an undertaker. People already keep their distance. If you go against the Reverend, you'll be an outcast. No one will sell you a loaf of bread. Give the girl back to her father, and this will all be forgotten." There was no direct threat in the sheriff's words, but its shadow was there, cold and sticky. It was an offer one couldn't refuse. "Sheriff," William said just as quietly, his gaze turning as heavy as lead, "during the war, I ran a field hospital. Hundreds of wounded men passed through my hands. I learned to distinguish truth from lies very well just by looking at a man's wounds. The wounds on this girl speak the truth, but the Reverend's words, they give me great cause for doubt. So you tell him that his daughter is safe, and as long as she is under my roof, no one will touch her." Henderson's face turned purple. He realized this wouldn't be an easy conversation. "You're making a big mistake, Thatcher, a very big one. I'll give you 1 hour to reconsider. Then I'll be back, and I'll have a warrant and a few strong men to help you make the right decision." He turned and stalked away, his steps heavy. William closed the window. 1 hour. Finch had given him 1 hour. It was an ultimatum. He returned to the room. Emma was standing in the middle of the floor, her face as white as a sheet. She had heard everything. "Now I've caused you trouble," she whispered. "My trouble began the moment I opened that door," William cut in, but there was no reproach in his voice, only a statement of fact. "Now listen to me carefully. We don't have much time. I need to know everything. Everything you remember about those maps. Any detail could be important. Where exactly were the marks? Were there any notes? Any names?" They sat at the table. William took out a sheet of paper and a piece of charcoal. Emma, straining her memory, began to describe what she had seen. Rattlesnake Canyon, an old abandoned track that stagecoaches used as a shortcut. A narrow gorge the locals called the Needle's Eye. The marks were just before it and just after it. A perfect place for an ambush. "He never acted alone," Emma added,
recalling scraps of conversation that had drifted from her stepfather's study late at night. He called them his apostles. He said they were bringing the word of God to the misguided rich, freeing them from the burden of their earthly treasures. William's face grew darker. Finch wasn't just a bandit. He was a fanatic. Or worse, a cynic who used religion as a cover for his greed and cruelty. He had built a cult around himself, a sect where robbery was elevated to a sacred act. And his apostles were likely desperate farmers or former Confederates, bitter at the world whom Finch had managed to charm and bend to his will. Such men were more dangerous than common mercenaries because they believed in the righteousness of their crimes. "All right," William said, finishing a rough map based on Emma's description. "That's something. Now we prepare." He didn't board up the windows or build barricades.
That would be too obvious and would only confirm Finch's claim that he was a madman. His preparations were different, almost invisible to an outside eye. He rearranged several crates of finished coffins in the workshop, creating perfect cover and firing positions. One of the coffins, the most expensive one made of polished oak, he moved to the window overlooking the main street. By removing the lid, he created an excellent protected position for firing from a prone position. It was sacrilegious, but at the same time, it possessed a dark irony that was so characteristic of William, using the symbol of death to protect life. He asked Emma to boil several large kettles of water. "If they try to come through the windows," he explained dryly, "boiling water will cool their ardor better than any bullet." He handed her a heavy wood-chopping axe. "Keep this with you. If I can't stop them and they break in here, don't let them take you alive." The words were brutal, but they held a harsh truth. Emma looked at the axe, then at William. The fear in her eyes hadn't vanished, but something else was mixed with it now, a cold resolve. She nodded. In that moment, she ceased to be a victim. She became a soldier in his small army of two. Time passed. The hour given by the sheriff had long expired, but no one came. The streets seemed suspiciously quiet. William knew it was the calm before the storm. Finch wouldn't use the sheriff. It was too direct. He would be more subtle. And then they heard it, the sound that echoed through Redemption every Sunday morning, the tolling of a bell. Then another, and another. It was the call to the morning service. William went to the window and peered cautiously from behind the curtain. He saw people making their way down the street, families in their Sunday best, men in stern coats, women in bonnets with ribbons, children scurrying alongside. They were all heading in one direction, towards the white church with the tall steeple, towards Reverend Finch. They were going for the word of God, not knowing that their shepherd was a wolf in sheep's clothing. "He won't come to us," William said quietly, his eyes fixed on the procession. "He'll make them come, all of them." The sermon began. Even from the funeral parlor, the echoes of Finch's voice reached them. At first, it was calm, fatherly, but gradually his tone shifted, gathering strength and fury. He spoke of a serpent that had slithered into their Garden of Eden, of a sinner who placed himself above God and the law, of a man who trafficked in death and had now dared to defile an innocent soul, a lost lamb. He didn't use a name, but everyone in town knew who he was talking about. Finch's voice thundered, reverberating off the walls of the houses. He was a skilled orator, adept at playing on the basest strings of the human soul, on fear, on hatred of outsiders, on blind, fanatical faith. He was turning his sermon into an indictment, a call to arms. William closed his eyes. He was on the battlefield again. Only this time the enemy wasn't an army in gray uniforms, but a mob of his neighbors, his clients, people whose deceased relatives he had respectfully seen to their final rest. Finch was turning the entire town against him. The sermon reached its crescendo. A deafening, furious roar erupted from the crowd. And then, the church doors burst open.
People flooded into the street, but they didn't disperse to their homes. They stood, clustered in a dense buzzing mass, all looking in one direction, towards the house at the edge of town, towards William Thatcher's funeral parlor. At the head of the crowd, like Moses before the Red Sea, stood Reverend Finch. In one hand he held a Bible, the other he raised to the heavens. "Brothers and sisters, the Lord is with us. We must tear this innocent child from the devil's grasp. Let us go and cleanse our town of this filth." And the mob, armed with righteous fury, began to move. They moved not quickly, but inexorably, like an avalanche. They were marching on William's house. "They're coming," Emma whispered, staring out the window with eyes wide of terror. William silently walked to the oak coffin by the window. He rested the rifle on the velvet lining and checked his aim. "Yes," he said, as calmly as if he were commenting on the morning weather. "They're coming. It seems I'll have a lot of work today."
Or does he have another, much more cunning plan? Write your thoughts below, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the epic conclusion of this story. The crowd was an ugly, many-headed beast, bound together by righteous anger and Sunday boredom. They stood in the drizzling rain that had started again, their faces turned toward the dark windows of the funeral parlor. At the front, like a shepherd before his maddened flock, stood Reverend Finch, his rain-soaked face glowing with fanatical ecstasy. He had created this monster in half an hour, sculpted it from fears, prejudices, and blind faith, and now he was ready to unleash it on his target. "Break down the door," someone from the crowd shouted. "Burn the den of sin," another chimed in. Emma stood behind William, clutching the heavy axe so tightly her knuckles turned white. She saw the faces in the crowd. Mrs. Hobbs, the baker, who always gave her an extra cinnamon roll. Mr. Abernathy, the blacksmith, who had once mended her worn-out shoe and taken no money. Now they were looking at her sanctuary with hatred. They wanted her blood, or rather the blood of the man who dared to shelter her. William was calm. His composure was almost supernatural against the backdrop of the storm raging outside. He wasn't looking at the crowd. He was listening. He analyzed its sound, its rhythm. He heard in its roar not only anger, but also fear. Fear of him, the undertaker, the man who lived on the border between worlds, and fear of themselves, of what they were about to do. "They're afraid," he said quietly, more to himself than to Emma. "And that's good. Fear makes a man think." He took the Sharp's rifle, but he did not go to the window. Instead, he climbed a small ladder leading to the attic. Emma heard him moving some boxes. Then, for a moment, there was a silence, pierced only by the roar of the crowd. And then the shot rang out. It was deafening, concussive. It was not the crack of a revolver or the pop of a shotgun. It was the deep, bass roar of a combat rifle, a sound that seemed to split the very heavens. The crowd froze and instinctively ducked. Women screamed. Finch scowled, trying to see where the shot had come from. The bullet, fired by William from the attic, struck the church bell dead center. A deafening, clanging toll resounded, rolling across the entire valley. It was not a call to prayer, it was a tocsin, an alarm. Before the crowd could recover, William's voice boomed from the attic. Amplified by the strange acoustics of the empty street, it sounded powerful and dispassionate, like the voice of a judge. "My name is William Thatcher. I was a field surgeon in the Union Army. At Gettysburg, I amputated 173 limbs in 3 days. I have seen what bullets do to men, and I know how to tell a man of God from a wolf in sheep's clothing." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Thatcher's past was a mystery to them all. No one knew who he had been before he appeared in Redemption. An army surgeon. That changed things. It gave him weight. "The girl in my house bears the marks of a brutal beating on her body.
I have treated her wounds. I have seen them with my own eyes. Now ask your reverend what verses from the Bible he was quoting when he gave her those wounds." The people's gazes shot to Finch. His face contorted into a mask of rage. He had not expected such resistance. He thought the undertaker would cower behind his door like a rat in a hole. "Lies!" he roared, drowning out the crowd's muttering. "It is the devil speaking through his mouth. He has bewitched my daughter. Do not listen to him. Forward, brothers, in the name of the Lord." He took a step forward, pulling his most zealous followers with him. A few burly farmers, armed with pitchforks and axes, ran to the door and began to strike it. The ancient oak groaned, but held. "Emma!" William shouted from the attic. "The windows!" Emma snapped out of her stupor. She dragged the kettles of boiling water to the windows. When the first of the attackers broke the glass and tried to climb in, she squeezed her eyes shut and flung the scalding contents at him. A wild, inhuman scream erupted. The man recoiled from the window, rolling on the ground and tearing at his smoldering clothes. His companions staggered back in horror. At that moment, another shot cracked from the attic. The bullet struck the axe held by one of the farmers, knocking it from his hands with such force that the handle splintered into 1,000 pieces. The man stared at his numb, vibrating hands, unable to believe he was unharmed. It was a demonstration. William Thatcher wasn't just shooting. He was showing them that he could kill any one of them at any moment. But he wasn't. He was giving them a chance to think. The crowd faltered. The beast Finch had created was beginning to fall apart. It was one thing to go and lynch the despised undertaker, but quite another to walk into the sights of a cold-blooded, unseen marksman who could shoot an axe out of a man's hands from 50 yards. "He'll kill us all!" a woman shrieked in panic. People began to back away, slowly at first, then faster. They were retreating from the cursed house, leaving only Finch and a few of his most loyal apostles, who now exchanged bewildered glances. The plan was falling apart before their eyes. It was at that moment, when the battle seemed won, that riders appeared at the other end of the street. There were a dozen of them. They rode fast and hard, and they looked far from peaceful. Each had a rifle slung across his saddle and a revolver at his hip. Their faces were hidden by the brims of their hats, but even from a distance it was clear they were not farmers or townsfolk. They were wolves, real wolves. The crowd scattered in panic, clearing the street. Reverend Finch, upon seeing the riders, first froze, and then a look of pure, unadulterated relief mixed with triumph washed over his face. He assumed they were his men, his gang, come to his aid. The riders pulled their horses to a sharp halt in front of the church. The leader, a tall man with a scar across his cheek, dismounted. "Reverend," he rasped, not noticing or ignoring the remnants of the crowd. "We heard the alarm bell. What happened? Did the law ride into town?" Finch faltered. He realized his mistake. These men were not supposed to be here. Not in broad daylight. Not in front of the entire town. But it was too late. One of the farmers standing closest recognized the man with the scar. He had seen his face on a wanted poster in the sheriff's office. It was Jedediah Scar Coltrane, a ruthless killer and robber whose head was worth $1,000 to the Wells Fargo Company. "That's Coltrane's gang," someone whispered. The whisper spread through the crowd like wildfire. The people looked at the outlaws, then at their reverend, and slowly, agonizingly, understanding began to dawn in their eyes. The Holy Father, the gang leader, the nightly absences, the generous donations, it all fell into place. They had been deceived. They had been used. Their righteous fury was merely a tool in the hands of a devil who wore a cassock. Jedediah Coltrane also realized something was wrong. He saw the frozen faces of the townspeople, full of horror and hatred. He saw their hands drifting toward the revolvers many of them wore at their belts. "Reverend," he growled, his voice no longer holding respect, only an icy threat.
What is going on here?" But Reverend Finch was no longer listening. His world had collapsed. The mask of the saint had been torn away, revealing the ugly face of a criminal beneath. He saw how the crowd, his flock, his weapon, was now slowly turning towards him. In their eyes, he read his sentence. In a desperate animal panic, he did what all cornered predators do. He grabbed whoever was closest and weakest. His hand shot out and clamped onto the shoulder of a little girl standing beside her mother. He pressed a small derringer, which he always carried under his cassock, to her temple. "Back!" he shrieked, his voice breaking into a high-pitched squeal. "All of you, back, or I'll put a hole in her head. Give me a clear path." The crowd froze in horror. Coltrane's outlaws, seeing their associate take a child hostage, exchanged uneasy glances. They were robbers, but even they had a code. And at that moment the door of the funeral parlor opened slowly, creakily. William Thatcher stood on the threshold. The rifle was gone from his hands. He was calm and looked strangely at peace, like a man who had finally found his place. He began to walk forward slowly, straight towards Finch. "Let the girl go, Alistair," he said quietly, but his voice was audible to everyone in the sudden silence. "Don't come any closer, Thatcher. I'll kill her. As God is my witness, I'll kill her," Finch screamed, backing away and dragging the crying child with him.
"You don't believe in God, Alistair," William replied, just as calmly, continuing his advance. "You only believe in yourself. But look around you. Look at these people. You have taken their faith from them. Look at your friends. You have betrayed them. You have nowhere left to run. Your sermon is over." Each of William's words was like a hammer blow. Finch glanced around wildly, his eyes filled with pure terror. He saw a wall of hateful faces. He was alone. In the moment when all attention was fixed on the slowly advancing undertaker, a shadow lunged at Finch from the side. It was Abernathy, the blacksmith, a huge, silent man whose daughter Finch was holding at gunpoint. In one motion he seized the Reverend's gun hand and crushed it in his monstrous fist. There was a sickening crunch of breaking bones. The pistol fell to the mud. Finch howled in pain. The girl broke free and ran to her mother. The beast, so long held in check, was unleashed. The crowd surged forward, falling upon their former pastor. William stopped and watched in silence as justice, raw and terrible, was carried out before his eyes. He felt no satisfaction, no pity. He simply felt tired. That evening, after Coltrane's gang had been partly shot down and partly arrested by a posse hastily assembled by a recovered Sheriff Henderson, and Reverend Finch's battered body had been locked away in the very jail he had funded, a quiet fell over Redemption once more. But it was a different kind of quiet, not sleepy but stunned and ashamed. William and Emma sat in his small living quarters. The windows were boarded up, and the air smelled of gunpowder and burn salve. William silently handed Emma a small leather pouch. It was heavy. "This is everything from the Reverend's study," he said. "I thought it rightfully belongs to you. There's enough here to get you not only to St. Louis, but all the way to San Francisco, if you like." Emma took the pouch. Her hands no longer trembled. She looked at William. The fear was gone from her eyes. In its place was infinite gratitude, and something else, something deeper. "And you?" she asked. "What will you do?" William looked out the window at the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "Me? I have a lot of work tomorrow. It seems I'll have more orders than I did all last year." His voice held its usual bitter irony, but his eyes were serious. "This is my town. I thought I came here to die in peace, but it seems I'll have to live here for a while, to remind them of how easily men can become monsters, and that even death has a conscience." Emma nodded. She understood. She stood up, walked over to him, and before he could say anything, she quickly, almost childishly, kissed his bristly cheek. "Thank you, William Thatcher, for everything." The next morning, on the first stagecoach out, Emma Granger left Redemption forever, heading towards a new life. William Thatcher stood on the threshold of his parlor and watched her go, until the coach disappeared over the hill. Then he turned, picked up a hammer and nails, and began to repair his door. There was much work to be done, and for the first time in many years, the work brought him something akin to peace. The story of the undertaker and the runaway girl became a legend in redemption, a legend of how the quietest man in town turned out to be the bravest, of how sometimes salvation comes not from a church, but from a funeral parlor, and of how, even in the heart of the Wild West, in a world full of cruelty and hypocrisy, one good man standing up for the innocent can change everything. If this story moved you as much as it moved us, please share it with your friends. And of course, be sure to subscribe to our channel because there are many more incredible stories ahead that prove the most thrilling plots are written by life itself. Thank you for watching.